Northern Ireland, January the 30th, 1972. A Catholic civil rights march in Londonderry defies a government ban on parades and comes into violent confrontation with British troops. It was a scene acted out 100 times in the troubled history of Northern Ireland over the last 4 years. What made this particular clash different was that it was the bloodiest ever to occur on the streets of Londonderry. At 4 o'clock on that Sunday afternoon, troops from the parachute regiment were sent through the barricades to restore order. Exactly what happened in the ensuing 30 minutes is not absolutely clear and is now the subject of a British government inquiry. What everyone knows is that at the end of that half hour, 13 civilians had been shot dead by the British Army. The troops said they'd been fired on first, that petrol bombs and acid had been thrown at them, and that they'd had no choice but to defend themselves. The demonstrators, on the other hand, claimed the troops had fired indiscriminately into the crowd. Whatever the truth of the matter, the fact remains that these shootings have made an indelible impression in Catholic minds. Almost before the ambulances had reached hospital, Catholics were calling it Bloody Sunday. As a community, they're now totally alienated from the political system, opposed to the British government in London, divorced from the Northern Ireland government in Belfast, and in conflict with the British Army, whom they now regard as an instrument for maintaining Protestant ascendancy in the province. The present conflict in Ulster is increasingly portrayed as the struggle of the Catholic minority to overthrow the legally elected government in Belfast and force a union with the Republic of Eire to the south. That may be the position now, but it's not how the trouble started 4 years ago. The whole of Ireland was ruled from London until 1921, when 26 counties in the south, the shaded area on this map, accepted a British government offer of Dominion status and eventually became the Republic of Eire with a capital at Dublin. The vast majority of its 2.5 million people was Catholic. But in the 6 counties of Ulster in the north, there were 1 million Protestants, descendants from the English settlers who'd moved in during the 17th century, and only 500,000 Catholics. The Protestants wanted to preserve their union with Britain, and they were given the status of a federal province with their own parliament at Belfast. In every Northern Ireland Parliament, or Stormont, since 1921, the Protestant Ulster Unionist Party has held power by a succession of large majorities over a fragmented opposition of several Catholic parties. The government has authority over purely domestic affairs. Matters of taxation, defence and external trade are reserved to the British government in London. The Protestant domination of Ulster is not displayed only in Parliament. Every year it's paraded through the streets of Northern Ireland's towns in the Orange Day marches, which celebrate the anniversaries of famous Protestant victories over Catholics in Ireland's violent past. The importance of these ritual occasions to the Protestant community was well expressed 2 years ago.
There are normally about 100,000 men involved in walking in various parts of Northern Ireland on the 12th. Now these people basically are demonstrating, as they have done for generations, their determination to preserve, first of all, the principles of civil liberty and of religious liberty, and they mean it for all people at all times and in all places. But in particular to demonstrate too their attachment to the British throne, and in Northern Ireland this really means specifically to demonstrate the determination to keep Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. This is what politics are about in Northern Ireland, and the reason that people feel pretty strongly about it, of course, is because our next nearest neighbour, the Irish Republic, in its constitution claims dominion over Northern Ireland. Of course, de facto it doesn't have any authority over Northern Ireland, but because that constant threat, as it were, is there, people feel very strongly about this in Northern Ireland, and that.
The origin of the present troubles goes back to 1967 and the formation of the Civil Rights Association, or CRA, which gave expression to the Catholic community's sense of injustice about its place in Northern Irish society. Marches were organised throughout the province, and within a year the CRA had become a mass movement. The CRA's demands for a fairer deal for Catholics were embodied in a 6-point programme. They wanted one man, one vote in local elections. In Londonderry's electoral roll, for example, registered firms could nominate as many as 6 people to vote. If a man owned 3 firms, he could therefore control 18 votes. Because of this, and the strange boundaries drawn around many political wards, the Londonderry Council had a Protestant majority, even though 2/3 of the town's population were Catholic. Housing was another grievance. Many Catholic families lived in overcrowded conditions in houses that deserved to be condemned as slums, and often the men in these families were out of work. It was a matter of some bitterness to Catholics that the allocation of new council houses like these outside Londonderry favoured Protestants. Other demands were for the disbanding of the auxiliary police force known as the B Specials, whom the Catholics saw as an instrument of Protestant repression, and for the repeal of the Special Powers Act, under which the police could enter houses without a warrant and detain suspects without trial. None of these demands was especially revolutionary, and the Northern Ireland Premier himself, Captain Terence O'Neill, agreed that they should be put on the statute book. But O'Neill was a moderate, and there were others within his party who wanted a more intransigent stand against reform.
Good luck. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Minister. How do you do? Nice to meet you. Very kind of you.
There were also others within the Protestant community who saw the civil rights campaign as a cover for seditious activities aimed at overthrowing the state and forcing a union with the Irish Republic. One of these was the Reverend Ian Paisley, who began to mobilize extreme Protestant opinion in a series of marches and meetings, which he regaled with his own particular brand of oratory.
The sort of Ulster we want is the Ulster where the loyalists shall walk, and shall walk without hindrance. And I'm pledging you, my friend, today that we're going to carry this battle to every end of this province until the day shall come when the Union Jack shall fly on every street and on every road.
The strength of this deep Protestant feeling finally forced O'Neill from office in April 1969. His successor was Major James Chichester Clark. His chief problem was how to satisfy his supporters in the Unionist Party without provoking a violent reaction from the Catholics. It proved an impossible task. In August 1969, the Protestants staged their annual Apprentice Boys March through Londonderry, an occasion commemorating the successful resistance of James II's Catholic siege of the city nearly 2 centuries before. Fighting broke out between Catholic and Protestant gangs, and the result was the worst rioting in Ireland for 50 years. The police, recruited almost entirely from among Protestants, tried to create order in the Catholic Bogside district of Londonderry. The Catholics barricaded themselves in and repelled police charges with stones, bottles and petrol bombs. Organising resistance at the barricades was a 21-year-old university student called Bernadette Devlin. She'd helped to found the Socialist People's Democracy movement in support of Catholic civil rights, and she now became a rallying point for extreme Catholic opinion. Like her counterpart among the Protestants, Ian Paisley, she later became a member of Parliament at Westminster.
I'm not asking you to hide behind the barricades. I am asking you to get A, the women, and B, the children, who, when the police charged...
As darkness fell on August the 12th, Londonderry began to resemble a city at war. More petrol bombs were thrown, and by the early hours of the next morning, whole districts of the city were ablaze, and rioting on this scale continued for 4 days. For every fire the firemen reached, a dozen others blazed unchecked. With the situation clearly out of control, the Northern Ireland government made an urgent request for British troops. On August the 15th, army units arrived from England and were hurriedly drafted to the major trouble spots. In Londonderry, the troops were hailed as saviours by the Catholics of the Bogside, who chanted their contempt for the retreating contingents of police. After Londonderry, the conflict spread like a forest fire across Ulster. The Catholics of Belfast also took to the barricades, and Protestant and Catholic gangs fought savage battles in the streets. In 2 days of violence, 10 civilians were killed and nearly 150 injured. As in Londonderry, whole areas of the city were put to the torch. Here, too, British troops went in to keep the warring communities from each other's throats. In holding the ring between the two sides, the troops had one thing in their favour. They were neutral. Neither side had any grievance against them. But the role of disinterested mediator was not one they were to be allowed to play for long, because each side regarded their function in a quite different light. To the Protestants, the troops were there as keepers of the peace and defenders of the state, and by implication of the status quo. To the Catholics, they'd been brought in as protectors of an oppressed minority. It's difficult to remember now that in those early days, the soldiers were the Catholics' friends, sharing cups of tea with them and friendly chats. The army's commander in Ulster at the time, General Freeland, was under no illusions about how long this honeymoon could last.
Impossible to say, but of course we are conscious of the fact that the honeymoon period is on now and it won't last forever. This question of impartiality is the absolute cardinal point. We are friends of everybody. We take no sides. I have laid these orders down extremely strictly. Everybody knows them. They're left in no doubt whatsoever at all about it. And as for the honeymoon period, how long the soldiers might become the target for everybody will depend on the politicians. If they can come up with some hope, some concrete policy, then the soldiers' position will be easier. But we're very conscious of the fact that you know, the honeymoon period can't go on for long.
The politicians now directly concerned were the British government in London. Home Secretary James Callaghan toured Belfast a few weeks after the troops had arrived. He was eagerly welcomed by Catholics and Protestants alike. The Home Secretary impressed on the Northern Ireland government the need for a political solution that would be acceptable to the Catholic community as a whole. A later meeting in London between British ministers and Major Chichester Clark produced the so-called Downing Street Declaration, which committed the Northern Ireland government to carrying through the original reform programme promised by Captain O'Neill. London also set up an inquiry into the disturbances, and in due course it reported that the police should be reorganised. The government accepted its recommendations for the disbanding of the B Specials and the disarming of the Ulster police force as a whole, a move bitterly resented by many in the Protestant community and which caused a further bout of rioting in Belfast. But the troubles died down, and at Christmas 1969, the troops were still keeping a fragile peace. They also still enjoyed the confidence of both communities, some of whom made a point of ensuring that the soldiers were not forgotten in the season of goodwill. Things remained quiet for the first half of 1970. There were few political initiatives from London because of the approaching general election, which was won in June by the Conservatives. Edward Heath became Prime Minister, and responsibility for Ulster fell on Reginald Maudling, the new Home Secretary. The new government was immediately faced with the prospect of that summer's Orange Marches, less than 2 weeks away.
Everybody off the road, straight back there. I have
The trouble began in the usual fashion, with stone-throwing and fighting between rival gangs. Throughout the day, rioting spread all over the city. The disorders went on for a week, at the end of which 10 people had been killed, nearly 300 injured, and £500,000 worth of property destroyed. The army had of necessity been spread very thinly throughout Belfast that week, and in some Catholic quarters there grew the mistaken belief that the troops hadn't made much effort to protect them from Protestant attacks. The suspicion was reinforced when army units, acting on information supplied by the police, carried out large-scale searches for arms on Catholic housing estates. Some arms were found, apparently stored by local units of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, itself an illegal organisation, but one which the Catholics regarded at that time as their own defence force against potential Protestant attacks. The searches caused serious rioting on the estates, and in retrospect can be said to mark the beginning of the Catholics' alienation from the British Army. From the middle of 1970 onwards, a growing proportion of Catholics began to lose faith in the troops and to give increasing support to the IRA. The IRA itself had split into two groups in 1969. The official wing, which had failed in its military campaign to unify Ireland in the 1950s and had since turned to political means, and these men, the provisionals, who relied wholly on the use of force to end Northern Ireland's connection with Britain. It was the provisionals who now took over in the Catholic areas and virtually declared war on the British Army. In February 1971, the first British soldier was killed by a provisional gunman. Early in March, 3 Scottish soldiers were shot in the back of the head outside a country hotel near Belfast. They were the first of 43 British troops killed by the IRA in 1971, and 5 more have already died this year. The army, of course, hit back where it could, and the IRA has had its cost in lives too. Just how high that cost has been is difficult to say, because many of the gunmen killed or wounded in clashes with the army were taken away by their friends before the troops could reach them. This escalating violence had political repercussions. Chichester Clark resigned in March when London agreed to send only half the troop reinforcements he'd requested. His successor as Premier was Brian Faulkner, the former Home Affairs Minister. His first move was a gesture of reconciliation, an offer to Catholic politicians to head 2 new government committees. But it was too late. The initiative was drowned in the rising tide of disorder. Gelignite bombings of public buildings were becoming commonplace events in Belfast. When the British government refused to set up an inquiry into the army shootings of 2 civilians in Londonderry, the Catholic opposition parties withdrew from Stormont, and they've stayed out ever since. As the violence increased, British troops were put under even greater pressure. And in London, the government finally decided to use a weapon it had until then shrunk from using: internment without trial. Internment had, in fact, been used in the previous wave of unrest during the 1950s. It had been bitterly opposed then and was no more popular now. Quite apart from their objections to the very principle of detention without trial, those who opposed internment claimed that prisoners at the detention centres, like this one at Homewood near Belfast, were being subjected to brainwashing techniques and even torture. A British government inquiry later ruled that there had been ill treatment, but no physical brutality or cruelty. But internment failed to reduce the violence. These Belfast houses were gutted by fire, apparently after their Protestant owners had been forced out at gunpoint by men who claimed to belong to the IRA. According to some reports, several houses were set alight by Protestants themselves to prevent them falling into Catholic hands. 16 people were killed when this public house in a Catholic area of Belfast was destroyed by a bomb at the beginning of December last year. In Amsterdam, 3 tons of weapons and ammunition were seized by the Dutch police at Schiphol airport. The arms, which had been made in Czechoslovakia, were said to be destined for the IRA. Keeping the arms out of Ulster presented the British Army with an almost impossible task. Even with regular helicopter patrols and roadblocks, the troops were unable to keep a round-the-clock guard along the whole of the 300-mile border with the Irish Republic. But what made the job more difficult was the large number of unspecified roads crossing the border. Eventually, the army found the only solution was to block them by blowing them up. Arms which were not stopped at the border had been covered in raids in the cities, a much more difficult and hazardous operation. It wasn't so bad when the troops received a tip-off about the precise location, but at other times the only recourse was to house-to-house searching.
We'll just go in and get some photographs and get some video.
This Belfast raid produced 2 Thompson machine guns and 200 rounds of ammunition.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Ulster's Catholics felt that both house-to-house searching and the policy of internment were directed at them rather than at the Protestants, and relations between troops and Catholics, already bad, deteriorated even further. There followed month after month of steadily increasing violence, which finally erupted into the tragic confrontation in Londonderry. For many Catholics, and especially for the activists amongst them, the events in Derry merely confirmed what they'd already come to believe, that the British Army was being used as a means of repression. Their sense of shock and outrage at the shootings was shared by fellow Catholics south of the border. In Dublin, capital of the Irish Republic, the British embassy was burned down by an angry crowd.
Burning down of the embassy.
I think it's about time it was done. It's a small price to pay for 13 lives that was lost in Derry.
But do you think that the violence here in Dublin should have gone so far as to actually burn down a building?
Yes, I do think so. It's an expression of the feeling of the people of Ireland.
Is this something you would...
Delighted that they've done this. It shows the Irish people's feelings and the slaughter that the British troops have been carrying out in the north of Ireland. And I think now that it might make the British government look up and try and get some peaceful way of solving the problem in the north. They might get down and talk.
To make the English people realise that we are not cattle to be slaughtered.
When you said it...
We have been peacefully protesting. We have been down here, a very patient people, for 4 years. And now you call us a rabble in your papers. We've been a patient people watching what you've been doing in the north.
You said it was a violence in Dublin will stop now, that it's now been got out of the system?
If the English people finally realise the truth, yes, it will. They should realise that they're our nearest neighbours, that we have never had any ill feelings towards them, but as long as they have this ridiculous, prejudiced, misinformed attitude to what's going on in Ireland, they will get more burnings. And they may get a war. But they must realize...
An extreme view, perhaps, but there are now far fewer people on both sides of the border who are still prepared to give reconciliation a chance. The Londonderry shootings could be a turning point in Irish history. It remains to be seen if it'll be for the better or for the worse.